Okay, well, we have one more event for the evening, but before I introduce Lauren, I do want to take a minute to share an event, Exploring by the Seat of Your Pants event that I think really ties really nice and close with what we were just talking about. So, most of our events may take place from a scientist or explorer's home, their lab, in their office, in the field with a really good 4G connection, but we do send satellite units out into the field and we broadcast from some pretty incredible places: tops of volcanoes, coral atolls, middle of the rainforest, deserts, Antarctica, the Arctic. We broadcast from some pretty wild places, but one of our most exciting, I would say, events lately was on World Rhino Day. We joined Rhino 911, which is an amazing group that use helicopters to intercept poachers, to get vets out into the field when rhinos are hurt, to do anti-poaching things like filing down and removing rhino horns, because the poaching is so bad in South Africa that by removing the horns in advance, dehorning the rhinos, it doesn't hurt them. They grow back over time. The poaching numbers fall drastically because the incentive isn't there. So I want to share a really quick clip from this event and then encourage you to go and check out this event. So just bear with me for a second while I share my screen. All right, where is it hiding on me? Okay. Live right now to Nico, flying by helicopter. Nico, how you doing?
Hey Joe, good afternoon to everybody there, and nice having you live streaming with us today. Thank you so much. A privilege on World Rhino Day.
Yeah, Nico, it's absolutely incredible. We've done a lot of events around the world. This is our first one from a helicopter, so you're making a little Exploring by the Seat of Your Pants history today.
Oh, that's beautiful, Joe. It's such amazing to have all the people on board with us today. I hope the signal lasts. So I really hope that it can pull through. We're in a little bit of a isolated area, but we'll see how it all turns out. This is Ryan Jeffries, the vet behind me. He's assisting us. He's the veterinarian today, so he's helping me with rhinos today. We're looking for a rhino that's got a horn. That's potentially a problem for poachers, so you'll see them through the CP line coming through now. And it'll be the back one. We're going to dart the back rhino. You can see there. Joe, have you got visual?
Yeah, we've got a visual. We can see them on the ground.
Yeah, so we're gonna just gonna put away the camera now, and then we're gonna start with the darting process. Joe, you'll see the animal is almost down and sleeping, so we have to get the vet down just quickly to just stabilize the breathing. I'm just.
All right, so I'm going to stop the share there and leave you wanting more. If you head to our YouTube channel, you can find the full event there if you search Rhino 911. So Nico, he was flying that helicopter while he was talking to us. The vet was in the back. They found the male they were looking for. They successfully darted it, landed the helicopter, dehorned it live for students. It took less than 10 minutes, and then the rhino was on its feet and then moving off again. Absolutely incredible. So I suggest you check that out. All right. So excited to introduce our final speaker of the evening. Lauren Eckert is a conservation scientist, a PhD candidate, and a National Geographic Explorer. She's an adventure enthusiast, and she's based in Western Canada. Her research takes her to the interface of ecology and Indigenous knowledge, natural and social sciences, and terrestrial and marine ecosystems. So we're going to bring her in now. Hi, Lauren. How are you?
Hello, everyone. Hey, Joe. It's great to see you. You didn't warn me I'd be following up live from a helicopter. I'm in a slightly less exciting environment.
I've been kind of holding that clip in reserve. And just talking about poaching and rhinos. I couldn't resist playing it. But now that we have you with us, that you're going to outshine it, no question. So
I don't know about that. I have no rhino action, but hopefully I have a good story to share with everyone.
All right. I love it. Well, Lauren, I'm going to let you take over for a little bit. And then, of course, we'll be waiting for some questions in the Q&A section.
Great. If everyone will bear with me, I'm just going to share my screen really quickly. No matter how many virtual festivals I do, it always takes me a second to get set up. So thanks again to all of you for being here tonight, and to Joe for inviting me. I am so honored to be at this festival, Women Who Blaze Trails Fest, celebrating two of what for me are the most important things of the world, which is empowering and being empowered by incredible women who are changing the world, and conservation practice, science, and storytelling. As Joe mentioned, my name is Lauren Eckert. I'm based in Western Canada, coming to you from my office/room in Powell River, British Columbia, Canada. And today I want to tell you all a short story about the power of collaborative, community-led research that combines multiple knowledge types, combines the power of many people, and also combines a diverse array of scientific disciplines towards building and better understanding a brighter world. Before I launch into telling you about the project that will dominate the story today, which is a project relating my master's degree in Canada, I'm going to start somewhere you may not have expected, which is in the montane rainforest of eastern Brazil. So 7 years ago, time flies, I was finishing my undergraduate degree. I was a student at the University of Notre Dame in environmental sciences in Indiana. And my undergraduate experiences up until that point had afforded me a diversity of research experiences around the globe. I had gotten to work with scientists on conservation projects in the high deserts of Colorado. I had researched forest deer mice in the Upper Peninsula of the US, and now had taken me here to South America, to these surprisingly cold, montane, highly fragmented forests of eastern Brazil, some of the most degraded rainforest in the world. These rainforests are also the home to the monkey that you see pictured here. This is a northern Muriqui monkey. I could gush about them all day, but I'll spare you. But one fun fact about Muriqui monkeys is that they are one of the only primate species that gives full frontal hugs, and they use hugs as a way to dispel stress and build community. And so often when Muriqui monkeys are being observed by researchers, by scientists, they get a little stressed out and they'll start hugging each other. They're fantastic individuals. It's a really cool species. And they're also, unfortunately, highly endangered because their home has been so fragmented by deforestation, mostly for the creation of coffee plantations in eastern Brazil. Now, I was a wide-eyed, very early career scientist on a project that I was really excited about, looking for these Muriqui monkeys. And our job, led by Brazilian researchers and scientists, was to find these monkeys and write very basic information about them, demography. So we were out to learn about where these monkeys live, how many are in each family group, how old they seem to be, what they do during the day, their general behavior, etc. And so I was a technician on this project, and I was so excited when we got there because I could not wait to see my first Muriqui in the wild. First day came and went without seeing a Muriqui, and I thought, oh, it's okay. I have tons of time still here to do this work. 14 days passed walking 8 hours in the forest every day, up and down these montane stretches. And as an early and naive ecologist, I was bummed out. This was exhausting field work, and it didn't slip past me that we were wasting a lot of time and expensive resources and researchers' time just trying to begin the research that we were setting out to do to conserve this species. So eventually, after 2 weeks of fruitless efforts, we did something that in retrospect should have been one of our first moves. And we invited a local guide, someone who worked at the local field station who had grown up in the Mata Atlântica rainforest, named São João. And we invited him to come into the field with us. Now, João came boasting extra homegrown coffee for the researchers and a serious certainty that he was going to be able to help us locate the monkeys. Now, I was in my 4th year of my Bachelor's of Science degree, and I was certain I had been exposed to all the important knowledge there is to find in the world of Western science and academia, which was wrong on many counts, as I would come to learn. But João had no formal education. He hadn't had the biological training I had been privileged to have, but he had grown up in this place, this rainforest so foreign to me that he called home. And despite my doubts in his capabilities and his knowledge source, within 2 hours, Joao had us in sight of our marquee monkeys, a huge family group of at least 10 individuals, sporting one brand new baby monkey, and also had a knowing laugh at my elatement and disbelief. And it was a moment of my very early career that would solidify a lot of lessons I had learned across my experience in the sciences and in the field, and also would lead me down the career path that I am now on. And that experience, combined with other experiences during my undergraduate degree, led me to two realizations. The first is that knowledge types not based in the narrow halls of the academy, not based in Western sciences and Western knowledge, are critical for informing and understanding management and ecosystems of animals that we hope to help survive through science and conservation. Not only that, but knowledge, local knowledge, Indigenous knowledge of peoples around the world is valuable in its own right, even though it's different from Western science. The second thing that was solidified for me this day was the growing realization that human beings are a critical component of ecosystems and conservation science and practice. And so often in ecology, we focus on animals, ecosystems, species we're interested in helping, saving, managing, when really conservation is a uniquely human feat. We need conservation because of the activities of humans. And if we want conservation to work, we need local individuals on board and leading efforts in conservation. And we also need to understand why humans do what we do. We're a fascinating species causing massive degradation to our shared home. And so these two realizations were really important to me early in my career. And I think back to this experience a lot because it was an aha moment for me. And they led me to my master's degree, which I'll tell you about today. I'm now a PhD student. This is past work, but a really incredible story to share about the way many people and knowledges can come together to better inform conservation. And so these realizations launched me to this much colder rainforest adjacent to the Pacific Ocean, where forest-covered mountains shoot out of the water as pictured here. This is one of the most beautiful places. I was able to do field work from a boat. I remember when I took this photo, it was a particularly warm day, and I even jumped out and went swimming for a little bit. And this is Western Canada, the central coast of British Columbia. I'll tell you more about that place in a moment. And so I was offered this incredible opportunity to work under the supervision of a woman, Natalie Ban, who's based at the University of Victoria, and in partnership with 4 Central Coast Indigenous nations who led the project I'll describe today. Before I launch into it, I want to acknowledge those nations that created the project I'll describe and to continue to carry it on even after my short stint was over. So those nations are the Newhalk, the Kitasoo-Hehe, the Wiikanu, and the Heiltsuk First Nations of the Central Coast. And my acknowledgements don't end there. Something else I want to do is acknowledge that I today am coming to you from Indigenous Territories as a visitor on those territories. And pictured here on the slide is a map from an excellent resource that I encourage everyone to check out, nativeland.ca, showing the territories of Indigenous nations here in North America, but providing insight into the world's territories of Indigenous nations. And I am coming to you live today from Powell River, BC, as I mentioned, which is the territories of the Tla'amin Nation and Coast Salish peoples. And in acknowledging that I'm visiting those territories, I also want to acknowledge that I, as a white individual, a settler, someone who is not Indigenous to this place that I am, have a privilege to recognize the impacts of colonization of Indigenous peoples across the world, but especially in North America, where I have lived all of my life, and recognize that that colonization has historical negative impacts and continues to have negative impacts on Indigenous peoples. Thus, part of my work is in recognition of the responsibility to support Indigenous scientists, scholars, peoples as they reassert their management rights in their territories, and to help promote decolonial research and lifeway paradigms. And I'll get into that a little bit more in this research I'll describe today. I highly encourage you to see whose land that you're on and work to facilitate better recognition of whose territories we're visiting. And so now I'll talk about the 4 territories and the 4 nations involved in the project I described. So I was lucky to be able to partner with this organization called the Central Coast Indigenous Resource Alliance, which is comprised of by 4 First Nations, as I mentioned, the Newhawk Nation in Bella Coola, BC, the Kitasoo Nation in Klemtu, BC, the Wikinew Nation in Wikinew, BC, and the Heiltsuk Nation in Bella Bella, BC. And these nations are very remote. Most of them are only accessible by float plane. One is accessible by road, but it is one of the more treacherous roads in the world. And these nations range in size from the smallest at about 40 people to about 1,500 to 2,000 people. But their remoteness, as well as their inheritance of Indigenous knowledge and their government structures, means that they rely even more than most of us do on local resources, on local species of importance. So under this umbrella organization, these 4 nations have come together to combine their resources, their power, their Indigenous knowledge, and create, through the Central Coast Indigenous Resource Alliance, research programs using independently collected science collected by these nations and Indigenous knowledge to set goals around how they want to manage the species and the places in their territories. And so I'm going to talk to you today about a fish called rockfish. And when I first imagined visiting Canada's Central Coast, often known as the Great Bear Rainforest, renowned worldwide as the Great Bear Rainforest, I certainly expected to be gallivanting behind spirit bears in the rainforest, but that was not the case. For my research, I ended up studying rockfish, which I was kind of meh about when I first began my research, but now you can't really stop me from talking about effusively. I'll do my best here today, though. So rockfish are fascinating creatures. They're very deep dwelling fish most of the time, as you can see in that bottom right picture on the screen. The species I focus on in particular is called a yellow eye rockfish. There are 36 species of rockfish that live up and down the coast of the west coast of North America. And rockfish are fascinating because they can live a really, really, really long time. A big rockfish, like down in that right corner, can be as old as 100 years old. The oldest known rockfish to science was 118 years old. Rockfish also are really vulnerable to fishing pressure and ultimately toward extinction. They grow continuously as they age, and the older, the bigger, the more experienced a fish, the more successful it is at reproducing. So old, big fish are really important to the population. And rockfish actually can't reproduce until they're 30 years old. So when older fish are caught and removed from the population, it's really dangerous to the health of that population. They're like elders of the deep who provide so much for the larger rockfish community. And commercial fishers, Indigenous fishers, and recreational fishers all go after rockfish as a source of economic, ecological, subsistence, food, and purpose. And so they're really vulnerable to exploitation. Also because that googly-eyed photo in the bottom left corner is a rockfish that has experienced barotrauma. So kind of like a diver who comes up to the surface too quick, rockfish can get the bends in reverse. Thus, if they're caught as bycatch on accident, they usually don't survive. This is a fish that the nations of the Central Coast Indigenous Resource Alliance warned scientists were in trouble. But there was no scientific data about what this fish population should look like available before 2002. So this is really, really not a good baseline to understand how these fish are doing. And here's just an example of how massive these yellow eye rockfish can get. As you can imagine, a big 100-year-old fish like this is targeted by commercial and recreational fishermen who want a good fishing story or want a ton of meat on a fish. But this fish is so important in the broader population. And so it's part of the reason these fish are so vulnerable. So recognizing these concerns and witnessing changes to yellow eye rockfish over the last half century, the Central Coast Indigenous Research Alliance nations mobilized to better understand the current and historical state of yellow eye rockfish in their territories. Like I said, no scientific data existed prior to 2002 for these fish, but there's a ton of Indigenous and local knowledge regarding yellow eye rockfish. So together with these Indigenous nations and local scientists, we embarked on a partnership to understand long-term changes to yellow eye rockfish by interweaving Indigenous knowledge, as you can see in this interview picture in the bottom where I'm talking to Ted Watkis, a hereditary Wikanuit chief, about his life history fishing in his territory. Collaboration was the core of this work. As you can see in the top image, this is at the Heltzuk Elders House, and I'm talking here, I'm having a workshop with a bunch of fishers who have spent their entire life in their territories fishing for species like yellow eye rockfish, and who have noticed every change that has happened because they rely on their catch to feed their families and themselves. So we engaged in tons of conversations with people, 2-3 hour talks over coffee about life experiences on different boats, finding and catching rockfish, among many, many other species. And while we were doing that, throughout our interviews, I also collaborated with Central Coast Indigenous Research Alliance ecologist Alejandro Fried. And we were able to go out fishing. I felt like I had the best job in the world because we did hook and line sampling, which basically means that you drop a fishing rod into the ocean for a set amount of time and catch fish. And by catching those fish, you measure how many fish might be in the area, then extrapolate that to understand things about the modern rockfish population. We were also able to send a towed video camera down to look at rockfish. As you can see in that top right picture, there are laser beams on the video camera, so we could estimate how big the fish were. When I have more time someday, I'll tell you all a story about all of the times that towed video camera got stuck underwater, because believe it or not, rockfish like to live in rocky habitats. So we were learning a lot, not only about fish in the past from Indigenous fishers, but also about fish now through methods of ecological science. And here I'm going to get a little bit sciencey on you because that's my thing. So we were able to access multiple data sources to better understand yellow eye rockfish. Here, I just want you to focus on the bold lines in the middle of the box as shown, which shows us the median yellow eye rockfish size. Now remember, the size of fish is really important because the bigger the fish, the more successful it is at having a bunch of babies. They actually give live births. They don't lay eggs. So it really impacts how many baby yellow eye rockfish are happening every year based on how big the average fish in the population is. So we summarized data that was available from scientific outlets, the data collected by the organization we partnered with, and the data collected by the national body, the Department of Fisheries and Oceans Canada, to say what is the average yellow eye rockfish size. And you see it's around 50. Those two estimates give us about the same thing. They sort of confirm each other. And what you'll see here is that when we asked Indigenous fishers about the size of today's yellow eye rockfish, they also gave basically the same answer as those scientific data sources did. So Indigenous Knowledge confirmed Western science information. And it was really cool to see that story stay consistent across the many knowledge types that we were looking into, that we were examining. And this is where it gets really interesting. So the little box I just popped up, that median line you'll see is at the very bottom of the box. But what we learned from Indigenous fishers is that over their lifetimes on the water, fish size had changed drastically. So it used to be that the average rockfish was about 75 centimeters in length. This would be an 80-ish year old rockfish. It's really reproductively successful. And over their 50 years on the water, they had seen yellow eye rockfish size change, which says to us, scientists, and eventually to managers, to the Department of Fisheries, Oceans Canada, and to these nations who are developing their ecological management plans for their territories, hey, something is going on here. We are losing the biggest and most important fish in this population and ending up with really young fish that might not even be reproducing. And because this fish is so important for people on the coast, this is a big red flag that was only made visible to us through looking at these multiple knowledge types and through these long-standing collaborations. And so here's a sort of visual image of what we see in modern rockfish size changing from the 1950s to 80s to today. As you can imagine, that's really, really dramatically important to understand for nations setting their management practices, for commercial fishers, for recreational fishers, for Canada as a whole. So the moral of the story, the end of my story that began with monkeys and ended with big, old, fat, yellow rockfish, is that there is an incredible opportunity to leverage information like this for policy changes in Canada and across the world. And our findings from this study support the powerful and complementary nature of Indigenous knowledge, local knowledge, and science, ecological science and social science, and also support the importance of Indigenous-led research and Indigenous-led management. Our conclusion was that the return of management rights to Indigenous peoples supports local conservation efforts and sustainable management goals. So the next steps in my PhD are building on this, figuring out how to tackle conservation challenges in Canada and how to implement what we learned at the federal policy level in Canada. And I'm sure I'll be able to tell you all about that some other time. But that is all the time I have today. So thank you so much for joining me, and I'm excited to hear any questions you may have.
All right. Awesome, Lauren. Thank you so much for sharing. You mentioned rhinos, following rhinos, but starting with monkeys, that's pretty well played. I think you countered that pretty well.
They're very charismatic.
All right. Very cool. So those who are tuning in, don't forget, we've got the chat bars on both Facebook and YouTube. So please send us in some questions. But let's get started with a couple that we have. First one being, when you approach the Indigenous community to work with them, did you find any hesitancy, maybe some skepticism at first?
Sure. I think there's a lot of really deserved skepticism for scientists, especially settler scientists like myself, engaging in research in collaboration with Indigenous nations because of a long history, not just of colonization, but also of parachute science, of this model of extractive or exploitative science by settler scientists at academic institutions. Key in this research to building positive collaborative relationships was that I entered a project that was ongoing, a relationship that was ongoing between my supervisor, who has committed to working with these nations for the long term, and these nations. And in addition to that, whereas a lot of models of parachute science, which we're moving beyond, I think, in ecology and conservation, have settler scholars arriving to communities and proposing their own research, then extracting the results for their career and moving on. Whereas in this context, I was really lucky to be able to become a partner on this work already in progress, where the nations had already outlined their goals for research. So I was able to use my academic skills to help them reach some of their goals in what is a much larger project that continues on to this day, and that has seen some really neat policy changes emerge because of the work led by these nations. So there wasn't a lot of hesitancy surrounding this project because of the carefully laid power structures, the reality that the Indigenous nations had defined questions that they wanted answered, and that there were clear deliverables from the academic side of things early on in the relationship. And I think that's a model that is building and continuing. Dr. Andrea Reed is going to be a speaker in this series. And she and I have recently worked on a project regarding a two-eyed seeing framework, where those things, the power sharing opportunities and knowledge sharings, are formalized in a framework that makes sure there's mutual benefit, so as to move beyond these paradigms of like extraction and exploitation.
Yeah, I think you bring up a really good point. There's a wealth of Indigenous knowledge that isn't being tapped right now, that could go a long way with Western science. What do you think the next step is to make it a little more mainstream, or to more scientists to reach to the Indigenous communities?
I think It's a really challenging question. I think especially for like a settler scientist to answer. But I do think that we live in really, really exciting times where opportunities for work like this is coming up more and more every day. I think the next step is for scholars, policymakers, academics, folks in predominantly Western institutions to accept, one, that Indigenous knowledge is valid in its own right, that it's not only when Indigenous knowledge is like subsumed into Western science that it's valuable, but also that scholars, academics, policymakers need to recognize the rights of Indigenous peoples to create management plans for their own territories using their own knowledge, or combining their knowledge with other scientific studies in their territories led by them, but also to follow Indigenous leaders, Indigenous scientists, Indigenous scholars. And we really live in an awesome time where that conversation, especially in Western Canada, is coming to the fore. And so I think a lot of what we as settlers need to do is listen and follow all of the leaders that are speaking really publicly and acting publicly as well.
Mm-hmm. All right. You mentioned that there was quite a few times that your camera was snagged. What was your protocol, your method of camera retrieval?
Yeah, so Dr. Alejandro Fried was the lead on the ecology side of this study, and he continues to work on this stuff to this day. And he had this, as you can imagine, very expensive, very fancy underwater camera. But it wasn't an ROV, so we had it attached to a very long insulated electrical line that would go out like 500 meters from the vessel we were on to get underwater. And we were trying to see where rockfish are, how many there were, how big they were. And I think probably 4 or 5 times in one summer, that tow camera would get wedged. It was only about this big, but it was really heavy to pull. I had crazy forearms that summer from pulling at this camera that was underwater, under the current. And what would happen is it would get wedged, and so we would have to have the boat driver, usually a guardian watchman from whatever nation that we were working in, circle where we thought it was stuck, because if we pulled too hard, we knew we could possibly pull the wire off the camera and lose our expensive gear at the bottom of the sea. And so you had this really comical situation play out where the boat would be circling this random spot, and someone would be staring at a tiny feed, the live feed from the camera on the boat, trying to tell us if it moved, and then one person would be just pulling as hard as they could, trying to get it unstuck. There was one situation where this happened, and the person watching the screen trying to tell us where the camera was got very seasick because we were on very choppy waters. And one of the days that I wasn't on the boat, I was in town talking to people, the camera was lost forever at the bottom of the sea. It eventually was replaced, but it is a classic example of the surprising challenges that come with ecological research and the limitations therein. Even fancy equipment doesn't always do what you want it to.
No, I think that's pretty inherent with all technology.
Yeah.
That it doesn't always do or cooperate on any given day.
No, definitely no.
All right, very cool. So you mentioned guardian watchmen. So through Exploring by the Seat of Your Pants, when we worked with the Gordani and Chani Wenjack Fund, we hosted a guardian watchman. For those tuning in who might not be familiar, can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, it's an incredible program that many folks are becoming more and more familiar with. So essentially, I talked a lot about Indigenous management, and part of management for Indigenous nations on the coast is also monitoring. You can't manage whole swaths of Indigenous territory or any ecosystem without knowing what's going on the ground. And so Guardian Watchmen are a program that is run in each nation, by each nation, but also sort of like a collective force. There are a lot of meetings of Guardian Watchmen, and they're tasked with research in their own territories, monitoring ecosystems in their own territories, informing territory visitors of local law, for instance, surrounding things like harvesting, and generally just spending a lot of time on local territories and local waters, identifying species. It's a really incredible program, and none of this research would be possible without the Guardian Watchmen who were on the boats grabbing those rockfish with us, helping us with those towed cameras, and who continue to do that work today. So the Tla'amin Nation, where I am now, also has a Guardian Watchman program. There are many up and down the coast of British Columbia and elsewhere, and I hope to see it continue to flourish. It's a really incredible way for nations to monitor and research in their own territories.
All right. So Christy is joining us, and Christy is just kind of commenting that fish size and quality seems to be important to those who are harvesting fish for their livelihood. So she's wondering if professional fishers are aware that there is this size reduction, and is your overall goal to see the population reach their former size? Yeah,
so this research was initiated because the nations who had been relying on these species culturally and for subsistence for, ultimately tens of thousands of years, but individuals who'd been relying on them their whole lives noticed this decline in size and were concerned about it. And the classic Western fisheries model, this speaks to one of our current limitations as Western scientists, or in the Western definitions of management. We think about fish in terms of abundance. So just like total pounds of fish that are out in the sea, which doesn't really consider things like age population dynamics, a fancy way of saying it matters how the ages are structured in a population. We think about this with people all the time too, right? What percentage of people are a certain age in a given population? It matters for the whole population. And so the goal of this research was to say the national fisheries management experts don't know about this age problem, this age structural problem in the rockfish population. And there's Indigenous knowledge regarding it, but that knowledge needs to be amalgamated. So it's all together in one place so it can be presented to policymakers alongside the ecological information that we have available. And so this and other studies really similar to it that I've been honored to complete with the Central Coast Indigenous Resource Alliance nations have helped to move the dial in the conversation on what matters in marine species management on the coast. Of course, Indigenous rights matter in that management, but also we need to start rethinking how we define successful management. Does it matter that there's 500 pounds of fish in a given place, or does it matter how old those fish are and how many fish there are and what sex those fish are? So that conversation is evolving. And the ultimate goal, is to help rockfish of all species, but especially yellow eye, rebound to a population state in which you have a healthy amount of larger elders of the sea who can sustain that population. It's a work in progress, but fingers crossed.
All right. Well, Lauren, thank you so much for sharing your work with us, sharing some of your story, sharing the importance of incorporating Indigenous knowledge into our Western science practices. The blast having you wrap up our first day of the Women Blaze Trails Festival.
What an honor.
Thank you. We're looking forward to following your work, and we'll have to see a little follow-up as you make your way through your PhD.
Thanks so much, Joe. I just want to say to everyone, feel free to reach out to me. My socials are Lauren E. Eckert, and I am happy to hear from you. I am always happy to talk to folks early in their career, women watching who don't know what direction they want to go, but know what they're passionate about, or folks interested in learning more about my research. Whatever you want to reach out about, I'm happy to chat further. So, yeah.
Excellent. We've got that up in a banner. Lauren, thank you so much. Hopefully we get to connect soon, maybe even in DC before too long.
I know. I hope so. Thanks so much for all you do, Joe. And I'm excited to watch the rest of the weekend.
All right. Thanks, Lauren. You have a great weekend.